Hey, everybody. I'm back. Yay. We missed you, Maynard. Yeah, whatever. Okay. Chapter 15, Race and Ethnicity. You know what? I came across a quote, and this really belongs in a previous chapter under poverty, but I think it's such a great quote, I want to read it to you anyway. This is a quote from Jay-Z. He said, "The burden of poverty isn't just that you don't always have the things you need. It's the feeling of being embarrassed every day of your life, and you do anything to lift that burden." Okay, well, I got some quotes about race and ethnicity for you as well. The great African American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, he was a sociologist in the early part of the 20th century. He said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," meaning race. Alexei de Tocqueville, I described him previously as the person who wrote Democracy in America in the 1850s, a French historian, philosopher who tramped about the United States and wrote observations about us. He said, "If ever America undergoes great revolutions, they will be brought about by the presence of the black race on the soil of the United States. That is to say, they will owe their origin not to equality, but to the inequality of condition." Richard Wright in the 1960s said, "There is no Negro problem in the US, there is only a white problem." President Clinton said, "White racism may be black people's burden, but it is white people's problem." Bell Hooks said, "All black people in the United States, irrespective of their class, status, or politics, live with the possibility that they will be terrorized by whiteness." Arthur Powell Davies said, "The world is now too small for anything but brotherhood." Amen, brother. Okay, starting on page 388, you need to know the difference between the terms race and ethnicity, which are often confused by people, but not for you after this session. Race, listen carefully to this definition: a socially constructed category of people who share biologically transmitted traits that members of a society consider important. Okay, a socially constructed category. Okay, so let me give you an example. As you look about society, you will notice that some people are tall and some people are short. You go, no big deal, whatever. You look around society, you see, some people have red hair, some people have blonde hair, some people have black hair, old people have blue hair, and you just go, just hair color, no big deal. Yeah. And you look around and say, hey, some people have brown eyes, some people have hazel eyes, some people have blue eyes, drunks have red eyes. And you just go, just eye color, what's the big deal? And you look around and say, hey, some people have light colored skin and some people have dark colored skin. You go, now that's important. Why? Why? How did that become important? Why do none of these other physiological features matter to us? Not at all. But when it comes to skin color, oh, that matters. And not only does it matter for some insane, illogical reason, but we even make a difference about it and subjugate people based on how dark their skin is. You know, your problem was you were born with melanin and rich skin. Why is that a problem? I'm trying to point out that if you step back and look at it all, it's just insane to judge people in any way, shape, or form by skin color, skin tone. Well, the Latin root word for race literally means root. There are no biologically pure races. Research shows, for example, that white and black Americans are genetically speaking quite mixed. This was confirmed when they completed the Human Genome Project, when they found there is nothing genetically distinguishing about race. Nothing genetically distinguishing about race. In fact, we would be on safer ground logically if we organized people according or classified people according to the size of their jawbone. At least there'd be some genetic basis for that, or lactose intolerance. There'd be genetic basis for that as well, but there is none for race. That is why the American Anthropological Association dropped those old categories of race called Mongoloid, Caucasoid, Negroid, meaning yellow toned people, brown black people, and white toned white skin or light skinned people. We're not actually white. Or my favorite was when I was a kid, there was a crayon called Flesh Tone. Guess what color the flesh tone crayon was? It wasn't brown or black. Anyway, so yes, there is no biological thing known as race. George Moore observed, after all, there is but one race, humanity. Yeah. Kenneth Kidd, Yale University geneticist, said there is not biologically, we are not, let me say it again, race is not biologically definable. We are all far too similar. I noticed that, I forget what it is, it's something like 98 or 99% of our genetic makeup is similar to that of chimps. And that I find totally reasonable as I look around society. Okay, ethnicity is a shared cultural heritage. It's from the Greek root word meaning culture or people. Like all aspects of culture, ethnicity is subject to change if people adopt a different way of life. So race refers to biological features as in skin tone and other aspects, whereas ethnicity is cultural. Okay, so what's ethnicity? Ethnicity is German American, Italian American, Filipino American, Japanese American, using America as an example. Those are all culturals and cultural heritages. Now, one of my pet peeves, I got a lot of them, and the big question is, what do you feed a pet peeve? Anyway, let me think about that a minute. What do you feed? Anyway, so people refer to the Latino race. The Latino race, that's so wrong. First of all, Latinos is just a broad category. Let's go back further. We'll go Hispanics. Hispanics is everybody who speaks Spanish or some dialect of Spanish, which includes people from Spain. So then we break it down further and go Latinos, which means everybody in the Western Hemisphere who speaks Spanish. Although probably we would include Brazilians who speak Portuguese into that category. Okay, I get it. For demographic purposes, look at Latinos, because if you didn't look at, the broad category Hispanics in America, how would you determine if a higher percentage of Hispanics are not live in poverty or getting equal housing rates? I get it for demographic purposes, but to refer to somebody as, oh, you're a Latina, you're a Latino. No, it's what country do you hail from? Are you from Puerto Rico? Are you from Cuba? Are you from Ecuador? Are you from Belize? See, each one of these countries is culturally different, and so it's sort of, it is denigrating to just refer to someone as a Latino, without, winnowing down a little bit further and say, what is your country of origin? My another one of my pet peeves is when people who are practicing ethnocentrism and have bias against people from Puerto Rico say, why don't you people go back to Puerto Rico where you come from and leave America? Hey, Ace, Puerto Rico is part of America. Duh. Now, within the Latino, what Latinx is some whites like to use, within that population, there are brown-skinned peoples, and black-skinned peoples in varying skin tones. So one could be white and be Puerto Rican. One could be dark brown and be from Puerto Rico. I had this discussion one time with a student who told me, well, my mother is very white and my dad is real dark skinned and she's from Puerto Rico. And I said, well, And she says, but my mother insists she's, she's how did she put it? I forget the comment she used, but I said, your mother's white. She has light skin. There's all this different variations within the Caribbean nations. So anyhow, that's the key. Now I get it again for demographic purposes. So you see these demographics, and I know you want. It's tempting to go race. You want to go check out right in human, just to mess with them more. Sex, and you write in yes, please. But I get it. Demographics are necessary in order to keep tabs on populations. Okay, now ethnicity, you can change it. Okay, biology, you can't change your skin tone, although God knows historically people have tried. If you go back to magazines that were predominantly read by African Americans, then they were Jet and Ebony, among others, you will actually see going back into the 50s and the 60s, skin creams you could buy that allegedly made your skin lighter, or things you could do to straighten out your hair, which many African Americans did because the whole idea was to look white. That way you wouldn't get persecuted by whites. Or a classic example even today is how when black students go to college, they have to act white in order to feel like they're assimilating and getting on. I always have a great time with inner city blacks who can turn on black English like that, but they don't in college. And I said, come on, give me some of that black English I love so much. And then, then they'll talk. It's great, but they've learned in college, okay, I got to turn that off. Gotcha. But obviously not with their family and friends. And why should they? Okay. So for example, in terms of ethnicity, you can make changes. Let's suppose, see, we got this interesting thing here in America where everybody's welcome, but first you have to go through getting a lot of shit thrown your way. So for example, I don't know, it's sort of like fraternity or sorority initiation or something. So first were the English, who hated the French, of course, hence the French and Indian War. Because they had Indians on the French side and you had Indians or Native Americans, I should say, on the British side, and they all fought each other. And then came the Revolutionary War and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the English hated the French, but they were at war for centuries anyway. Then came the Germans. Okay, well, we don't want these Germans here, so the English resented the Germans, gave them all kinds of crap. Then once they were here, what was the next group? The Irish. Okay, now we hate the Irish, and there was all kinds of resentment and jokes about the Irish. Then came the Italians. Oh, there's all kinds of jokes and stuff about the Italians as we all step on them. And so you're all welcome, but you're going to have to go through the initiation process. Okay, so one of those groups was Polish people. And when I was a kid, there was all kinds of disparaging jokes about Polish people. And so let's suppose I'm Polish and I have a name like Jaroszynski. And what was interesting is when people came in from Europe, immigrants into Ellis Island, the ethnocentric officials who worked on Ellis Island, immigration officials, would say to somebody like Jaroszynski, I can't pronounce that. Sure you can, just try, break it down. No, I can't pronounce that. For now on, your family name Smith, and boom, stamped it. That was it. For now on in America, your family name was Smith. Okay, but let's suppose my name's Jaroszynski. So people can identify me as Polish. Perhaps I have a Polish accent, and so I'm getting all kinds of jokes at my expense, and I'm sick of it. Okay, so I get rid of the accent. I change my name to Smith, and I can blend right in. I can assimilate. Again, it's very difficult for people with skin tone differences than white to blend in and not be dissed by whites who have racism. Okay, minorities. Oh, by the way, this is also true of the broad term Asian Americans. No. There's a huge difference between somebody raised in Japan or South Korea or Thailand or the Philippines or Hong Kong or Cambodia. These are all different ethnicities, cultural ethnicities. So I get it, Asian Americans, broad term for demographics, but you really need to winnow down and get to that person's cultural heritage if you want to understand him or her. Minorities, Any category of people distinguished by physical or cultural difference that a society sets apart and subordinates. Okay, so would Native Americans fit this definition? Yes, because they are distinguished by physical or cultural traits. Because of intermarriage, that's less so. But there's a stark difference between people who live on reservations who are Native Americans and have been there for a long period of time intermarrying, and the people who live outside who are not Native Americans. You can see physical differences. And to the extent that Native Americans retain their tribal language, there would be language differences. Why is this important? Because they're identifiable by the majority, as in, I see who you are, and so I can discriminate and evidence prejudice against you because I can identify you. You're one of them. Okay, and do we subordinate them, which is the second part of the definition? First, are you identifiable as a minority? Second of all, do we subordinate you? Yeah, Native Americans have the highest percentage of poverty of any minority group. How about people who have physical challenges? Yes, obviously, their physical challenge identifies them, which, by the way, uh, almost all of us it's in some point in our lives will be physically challenged. You broke a leg, you're on crutches, you're physically challenged. So at any given time in America, 10% of the population is physically challenged. If your grandmother or grandfather is using a walker, she or he is now physically challenged. So it's not people who are necessarily born that way. It's a status that we achieve as we grow on in our lives. Do we subordinate them? Clearly we do. That's why the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, because physically challenged people were being subordinated by the rest of society. Another example would be women. And I point that out because women are a majority of the population, but minorities does not refer to the numerical term or the mathematical term, I should say. It refers to the fact that women are identifiable by their physical attributes, and they are subordinated in society, by men in society, I should say, as we saw in the previous chapter. Alrighty. Even though so much focus has been placed on people from Mexico, Central America, crossing the border in the United States, that's not the largest growing immigrant group in the United States. Asians are the largest new immigrant group, and that's been so since about 2010. So despite the current administration's emphasis on, closing that southern border and, keeping people from coming in here, the biggest influx is Asian Americans. Apparently we're okay with that because I don't see us building some giant wall along the Pacific coast. All right. Personally, I think we should be more concerned about keeping Canadians out of here. First of all, do we really want to deal with Canadians coming in here and not knowing our language? Like, please. Okay, there's also a difference between prejudice and discrimination, and you need to know it for the exam. Prejudice is defined on page 392. It's a rigid, meaning it's not easily changed, rigid, irrational and unfair generalization about an entire category of people. And as you might imagine, the Latin root word is prejudgment, prejudice, prejudgment. So in other words, as long as I know you're a member of this group, I either like you or I don't like you. I don't even know, I don't even want to need, I don't need to, nor do I want to know you personally to make any kind of estimation about you as a person. You're a member of that group, I either like you or I don't like you. Prejudices are supported by little or no direct evidence. They are common in every culture and they can be positive or negative. That's why for years, Asian Americans were the so-called model minority group. That was something I think was used to throw in the face of Black Americans by saying, why can't you be like these people? Look what they've achieved. But actually, when you look at their poverty rate, they got a higher poverty rate than the national average, than the poverty rate for the overall population. So they're not doing all that well either. Now, I would argue, and we'll get into this in a bit with the cultural theory of prejudice, is I would argue it's impossible to be born in America and not learn prejudices. So everybody's got them. You got them. You're not the exception. You're the norm. Stereotype, an exaggerated description applied to every person in some category of people. They are shaped by cultural values and attitudes, and they grossly distort reality. So stereotypes come in sets, or I should say even the prejudices come in sets called a stereotype. Sometimes when I've done some prejudice reduction workshops, I will start out by writing on the board. Now, I'm not saying you think this or you believe this, but what have you heard? What's out there in terms of stereotypes about the following group of people? So I'll put up Jews. Oh, people are rattling stuff off. I don't even have to look around. I'm writing on the board as fast as people are saying the stereotypes. Okay, how about African Americans? Well, I'm writing stuff down. Okay, good. How about Puerto Ricans? Oh, writing stuff down. Then I'll write on the board whites. And there's dead silence, unless, of course, there's minorities in the classroom. And then I'm writing things down like anti-family, black wannabe. Here we are. I don't like you because you have dark skin. Yeah, well, how come you're always in the tanning salon trying to get dark skin? Black wannabe, huh? Anyway, so what? And then, when I'm writing these things down, white people going, oh, there's stuff about us too? Duh, yeah. Okay, there are also European stereotypes. Want to hear them? Yeah, sure, yeah, I know you do. Heaven is a place where the cooks are French, the police are British, the mechanics are German, the lovers are Italian, and the whole thing is organized by the Swiss. Hell is a place where the cooks are British, the mechanics are French, the lovers are Swiss, the police are German, and the whole thing is organized by the Italians. Well, of course, those are distortions. However, there's always a bit of a kernel of truth in some of these stereotypes in terms of, well, where'd they ever come up with that one? So, for example, if you ride the trains in, say, Switzerland or Germany, they are precise to the freaking minute. They pride themselves in coming in exactly when they're supposed to arrive at the station. You get down to Italy and ride a train. If that damn train leaves or arrives within 1 hour when it's supposed to, you had a real good day. Now, the lovers are Swiss is in hell. I love that one to tell all my Swiss friends, by the way, Okay, as an example of other stereotypes, political campaign polls indicate that identifying a candidate as Jewish results in an immediate 10 to 20% drop in favorable rating. But we're not anti-Semitic in America. No. We're way beyond that. Let me give you another example of changing stereotypes. This is stereotypes by white university students of black people. In 1932, white university students considered black people to be superstitious and lazy. In the 1990s, those stereotypes changed to loud and aggressive, a shift toward more threatening images to white people. Again, stereotypes are nothing new. The French philosopher Montaigne in 1580 said, "We call barbarous anything that is contrary to our own habits." Racism is the belief that one racial category is innately superior or inferior to another. As is noted in your text, historically, this assertion has provided a powerful justification for subjecting others to social inferiority. Theodore Roosevelt, who is he? President, United States, charge up San Juan Hill, teddy bear, National Park System, cousin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, anything? Nah. Anyway, he said this when he was president in the early 1900s. He said, "Now, as to the Negroes, I entirely agree with you that as a race and in the mass, They are altogether inferior to the whites. Bet he didn't get the black vote. That's right, blacks effectively couldn't vote, so really didn't matter. He could say what he wanted. Okay, there's a difference between individual versus institutional racism. Today we call it systemic racism, is the current buzzword, but institutional racism and systemic racism is the same thing. In 1960, Stokely Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton wrote the book Black Power, as an inspiration for the then Black Power movement. Stokely Carmichael was an interesting guy because he was part of the original civil rights movement. He was one of the freedom riders. If you know your history about the civil rights movement, the people who went on the bus ride and got the crap beat out of them by angry white mobs for having the nerve to ride in the front of the bus. Anyway, he later went on to decide that nonviolent tactics would no longer work, and so he advocated a more aggressive position, ensconced in the book Black Power and the Black Power movement. In the book Black Power, he and Charles Hamilton in 1967 wrote, "Racism is both overt and covert. It takes two closely related forms: individual whites acting against individual blacks, and acts by the white community against the black community. We call these individual racism and institutional racism." So his point being that with institutional or systemic racism, it's woven into the institutions of society. So, for example, when you look at the criminal justice system in America, and it was as bad as approximately, I'm going to give it a more, I've seen two different things. This, the more modern update is that whites on average serve 35 to 50% less jail time than do blacks for committing the exact same crime, or the disproportionate number of blacks on death row in states across the United States are all examples of systemic racism. Or, for example, when the New York Police Department had the stop and frisk policy, which designed to target minorities, that's systemic racism. So it's one thing to say, well, there's some bad apples in the police department who are racist. No question, that's absolutely true. But this was the entire police department policy, right? So that's systemic racism. So a few bad apples, cops who are racist and acted accordingly in crunch time, as we've seen with many of the incidents in the last few years. That's individual racism. The fact that the police department was stopping and frisking minorities, that's systemic or institutional racism. Okay, you also need to know about the 4 theories of prejudice, and they begin on page 395. I will start with scapegoat theory. A person or category of people, typically with little power, who is unfairly blamed for the troubles of others. It results from frustration, usually economic frustration. So only when people are economically frustrated do they look for someone to blame for it, a scapegoat. And rarely is it the system itself or or the government. It's some other group of people, usually a minority. So again, it results from economic frustration. Think about it. You don't have anybody to blame if everything's going well in your life. So if you're making adequate money and everything's okay, you're not frustrated. So only when you're economically frustrated do you feel you have to blame someone. The term scapegoat, by the way, is rooted in the practice of the ancient Hebrews of ritually placing everyone's sins on an animal that was then sacrificed. My guess is it was a goat, but not necessarily. It could have been a sacrificial lamb too. As is noted in your text, the classic example is Hitler using the German Jews as scapegoats for Germany's post-World War I problems. After World War I, we imposed, meaning the Allies imposed, heavy-duty sanctions on Germany that just crushed their economy. and the people there are frustrated. And so it results in the opportunity for a person like Hitler to rise to power. And in their frustration, who's he going to blame for all their problems? Um, they're going to blame the Jews, and it's stuck. This is nothing new because Jews have an unfortunate history of being scapegoated, as is evidenced in the Crusades, for example. What would happen is, as the Crusaders would march from England and France to the ports of the ports where they would depart on ships to go over to Jerusalem, you have to keep your sword play up. It's sort of like the U.S. military. You got to have a war every 5 to 10 years, because otherwise, how do you know the weapons, the new technology works? And you got to keep the troops sharp, and the only way to keep them sharp is actually participate in a war. So anyway, it's the same with the Crusaders. They're marching across Europe. It takes some time to get there, weeks. And so how do you keep your sword play sharp? So you go to the cities, say, hey, send out the Jews. We'll carve them up for you. And, that way you'll get rid of the Jews and we can get some sword play in. Much of the Christian prejudice against Jews is rooted in the Jews killed Christ theory. I hasten to point out which Christian ecumenical religious leader tried to dispel. I hasten to point out, first of all, Christ was a Jew. And second of all, my other way of looking at it is, you know what? That was 2,000 years ago. Let it go, people. Let it go. Second is authoritarian personality theory. This was developed by social psychologist T.W. Adorno in 1950, who identified authoritarian types of personalities, or we call them A-types. Now, A-types are also people who at work have high blood pressure, driven by work, real intense people, authoritarian personalities. We talked about authoritarian personalities in the workplace before, my way or the highway. But he said it's also extreme prejudice is a personality trait that's common in authoritarian types of personalities. These types conform rigidly to cultural values and believe moral issues to be a clear matter of right or wrong. There are no shades of gray. They tend to express strong prejudice toward all minorities. Well, that's really true, because if you read white supremacist literature, things they say, they hate all the minorities, right? And they also think of Jews as a race, which of course makes no sense. They're a religion, and or if you practice traditional ways, a culture. And they believe that Jews are running the country, and that the leaders are just puppets of the Jews, and that they work together with blacks to keep blacks, here in America and have any semblance of power. So whites are opposed to blacks and Jews, and white supremacists are opposed to blacks and Jews and the government altogether. I think you're seeing this with militia groups as well, right-wing militia groups, most notably in the news by the group of 6 that tried to kidnap the governor of Michigan, a female governor, which also rankles them, because a female telling them what to do, because they didn't like the fact that she was telling them to have to wear masks, and that we have to stay at home because of even though it has an impact on the economy, out of health concerns because of COVID-19. Okay, so what they found is that disproportionately authoritarian parents had kids who ended up being bigoted like they were, which kind of makes sense. Is it what all starts in the family? Of course, where do you think we initially learned our prejudices? From the family. Now, this doesn't mean if you had authoritarian parents, you're a bigot. It just means disproportionately bigoted people had authoritarian parents. Conversely, parents who raised their kids in a more democratic style, those kids were tended to be more flexible in the moral judgments and tended to treat people more equally. It gets back to, and this is all in my book, Everything You Ever Needed to Learn You Could Have Learned in Classic Rock. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young when they sang, "Teach Your Children Well." 3. Bogart's cultural theory of prejudice. He argues some prejudice is a general element of all cultures, not simply a trait of some A-type personalities. So the authoritarian personality gets into individual racism and kind of says, okay, there's some crazy ass crackers out there doing some hateful things to black people, but hey, the rest of us are cool. It's not woven into society. Whereas the cultural theory of prejudice says we've all been raised with prejudices. Of course, it's woven into society. How could it not be? You know, if you got that many people with prejudice, of course, it's going to be reflected in the institutions of society as well. So Bogart said prejudice is routinely expressed by people well adjusted to a culture of prejudice where certain peoples are viewed as better or worse than others. And so it becomes normative, not normal or acceptable. It's just like, well, I'm no more prejudiced than the next guy, so I'm okay. No, that's not okay. You have prejudices. So how did he figure this out? Check out figure 15-2, and you will see that they use scales of social distance. So they would ask questions like, would you be willing to work with a black person or a Jew? Sure. Would you have one? Would you be okay with one being next door? Yeah, I don't know about that. How about being friends? No, definitely not. So scales of social distance. As is noted in your text, a recent study using the same social distance scale as in figure 15-2 found that today's students express less social distance from all minorities than students did several decades ago. His first studies were actually done in the 1920s. Also, today's students see fewer differences between various categories of people. In 2011, Muslims and Arabs were held to be the most distant, and that's been true since 2001. You know, it's after 9/11, all of a sudden, all the vitriolic and ethnic and racial hatred was directed at Muslims and Arabs here in the United States. You know, and I'll never forget, I forget who the heck the black comedian was, but he said the only good thing that's come out of 9/11 is it temporarily took the heat off of blacks. All too true. Now, this is nothing new either with this prejudice against Muslims and Arabs. This goes back even into the 1990s and prior to that. You can see lots of movies that came out where the villains were people from Arab states in the Middle East and Muslims. But, you know, here in America, and I'll give you a great example. So what we did with 9/11 is we assumed that since those attacks were carried out by Muslims, therefore every Muslim is a terrorist, which is, of course, a grossly distorted exaggeration. It was what, 20 people? So 20 people, you're going to judge millions and millions of Muslims around the world as being all terrorists based on the actions of 20 people? But that's what we did. Now, you hang on to that for a moment. Here's what happened with the Oklahoma City bombings in the 1990s. You may recall that a federal government building in Oklahoma City was blown to smithereens, killing kids in a daycare and hundreds of people. And immediately when that happened, the FBI hired more people who were Arabic speaking because they had to figure out, you know, what Muslims, what Arabs carried out this horrible act of terrorism. And around the country within the next 2 to 3 weeks, Muslim mosques were all attacked. And guess what? They found out it was 2 Christians who committed the bombing. That's right. In fact, both were ex-military, served in our US military. They conducted the bombing. Now, did that provoke an outcry against Christianity? No. Do you see how distorted this is to attribute terrorism to all Muslims? We certainly didn't do that to all of Christianity because of 2 crazy Christian guys. But see, logic has nothing to do with stereotypes. They're irrational. Okay. You know, the other thing is we make no discrimination. Literally on the day of 9/11, when it was happening, there were people who were Sikhs who wear a turban, and they're from India, not the Middle East, India, and they were attacked. And in the next few months, several were killed because people thought they were terrorists from 9/11. Like, duh. It's just sad. Okay, Ruth Benedict said, the recognition of the cultural basis of race prejudice is a desperate need in present Western civilization. Next theory of prejudice, in fact, the last one, is the conflict theory of prejudice, based on the social conflict point of view. Remember, radical liberal point of view. It argues, in addition to being an element of culture, prejudice is also generated by social conflict among categories of people. It arises as a type of ideology that justifies the oppression of minorities. Black power activist H. Rap Brown wrote in the 1960s, racism is as American as apple pie. Well, why does he say that? Well, because as Robert Blauner observed, the US was founded on the principle that it was a white man's country. Well, literally, only white men, and at that, only white men with land could vote. Women couldn't vote. Blacks for census purposes. Now, this was a demand by the Southern colonies. Lots of accommodations had to be made by the Northern colonies to get the Southern colonies to come along and not make slavery an issue. Otherwise, they couldn't form the Union that eventually becomes the United States. So one of those was in terms of determining representation in the House of Representatives, which is based on population, the Southern states didn't want to be outvoted or out represented, I should say, by the Northern colonies. And so they insisted that blacks count. But since blacks were slaves, each black would count as 3/5 of a person in the census count. Marx thought that prejudice toward minorities served the interest of the ruling capitalist class by dividing the workers. Now, today you can go to Northern Ireland and you can go to Belfast and you can visit the site, like a tourist site of where Bloody Sunday took place and all the killing because of the battles between Irish Catholics and the Protestants in Britain and in Ireland itself. But anyway, hopefully that's all part of a bygone era. But this is how far back it goes. Remember, Marx wrote in the 1850s, he said, quote, the ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power. So, the idea being, as long as we're divided and blaming each other, then, like in scapegoat theory, then we'll never unite around our common causes. So, for example, a classic example is, the economy is struggling. Now, this was prior to the pandemic, when in fact it wasn't. We had one of the lowest unemployment rates in U.S. history prior to the pandemic, which is an economic trend that goes back to when Obama was president, that continued into the Trump administration, economic growth trend. Anyway, so at that time, people were still arguing, these immigrants coming over here, they're taking away our jobs. Taking away your jobs, these are jobs like field hand and nurse's aide that white people don't even want to do. We don't work in agricultural work, so they're not taking away our jobs. They're doing needed jobs we refuse to do. Anyway, but that's another way of scapegoating. So, they're taking away well, first of all, what makes you think it's your job? It's the job. Your mistake is in thinking they're taking away our jobs. What do you mean our? It's the job, not our job. Your basic premise is wrong right off the bat by assuming it's our job. But anyway, just blaming them, No. See, if the economy's going south, it has nothing to do with immigrants taking away your jobs. It has something to do with how we're running the economy, or how the capitalism itself operates, which is boom and bust cycles, up and down. Okay, we're finally at the difference between prejudice and discrimination. Discrimination is defined on page 396 as treating various categories of people unequally. Prejudice is an attitude, whereas discrimination is a behavior. So prejudice is something in your head which you may or may not act on. So, like prejudice, discrimination can be either positive or negative. So, if you have prejudice and you don't act on it, the sociologist Robert Merton called that a timid bigot. And something I've observed in recent years is that for a long time, until Trump became president, for a long time, people who had some prejudiced thoughts would just keep them on the down low. And then every now and then, person to get drunk or just burst out with something saying, "Whoa, my," and they go, "Oh my God, that's a racist statement," blah, 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 blah. Well, you can only keep it on the down low so long, and this going to come burst out if you don't start working on your prejudices first and eliminating them. On another note, do we take it too far sometimes? So if a person said, okay, we're all born with we're all not, nobody has a prejudice gene. We all learn prejudices. Okay, so you learned it. And so people say, well, I'm not a racist. Well, that doesn't mean you don't necessarily have racist thoughts. There is a difference between white supremacists who are racists, among other groups, among other categories of people who are racist, and the rest of us who have racist attitudes, but certainly don't subscribe to white nationalism or anything like that. And so if you do blurt out something like that because you don't realize it's in there and you haven't gotten a hold of it yet because of what's called unconscious bias, proof that we all are raised learning certain biases, should you now lose your job for the rest of your life? Now, I get it in certain positions, yeah, but this has destroyed people's careers because of one outburst. So I'm not defending it. I'm simply saying, have we taken it too far, saying, well, that's it, your career is ruined. You actually said a prejudiced thing. I know it's not popular position you're taking, Maynard. I'm just saying it's also going too far with the cancel culture, in my opinion. Oh, right. Okay. Prejudice and discrimination. The vicious cycle is described on page 397. I'm going to give you an example of it as you look at that chart that's there to show you how this works and that it consistently is even working as I speak. So if you look at stage one, and I'm going to use as an example African Americans. So in stage one, prejudice and discrimination begin often as an expression of ethnocentrism. In other words, my culture is better than your culture, or an attempt to justify economic exploitation. Okay, to justify economic exploitation. So justifying economic exploitation could include corporations deciding to move their operations to China because why would I want to pay an American worker 18 bucks an hour where can I pay somebody in China at that time 25 cents an hour? Now it's much higher rate than that. And so how do you justify it? Hey, it's just business. Well, what about all the workers you just fired or laid off because they don't have job? It's just business. The bottom line is the bottom line. So you just justify it in some way. And you justify by saying, well, after all, the products will be dramatically cheaper and that'll help out the American worker. Well, they weren't that dramatically cheaper, not from $18 to 25 cents an hour cheaper in prices of the manufactured goods coming from China. Absolutely cheaper, but not that much cheaper. Okay, so when you're running a business, approximately 40% of your costs of running a business are labor costs. Okay, so what's the cheapest form of labor? Slave labor. Hey, you can't beat that. So here you are, a Southern plantation owner, and you don't want to be out there picking that cotton. It is back-breaking hard work in that heat. You don't want to do that. You want to just sit on the porch and sip mint juleps and run a whip. And so what do you so what do? Yeah, you enslave people. And so you're going to enslave them for economic exploitation, but how do you justify it? So here are the justifications. In 1619, Africans, most of whom have been born into free families in villages located within a few hundred miles of the West African coast, are either captured in war, kidnapped, or sold into slavery by other Africans. They are sold to European or colonial slave traders or ship captains. So the way it worked is they packed 200 to 300 in a ship, and then they'd be sent to the West Indies or to colonial America. So the Caribbean, in the South, Southern Hemisphere, many went to Brazil because the Portuguese were also involved in slave trade. But for our purposes, we're talking about North America. Now, 200 to 300 are packed into these ships, and en route 10 to 20% just die because of horrible conditions on the ships, and that was just factored in as a cost of business. Okay, you're going to lose 10 to 20%, but you just charge enough to compensate for losing the 10 to 20% of people. Between 1619 and 1780, slave ships brought approximately 300,000 Africans to British North America. By 1870, approximately 9.5 million slaves were exported to the Western Hemisphere, mostly to Brazil and the Caribbean. So in the Caribbean, they would typically grow sugar. And then later on, that was also the case in Louisiana and Texas as they became hotspots for production of sugar here in the United States. A significant portion of the slave trade was controlled by a slave trading dynasty headed by an African named Grandy King George, a powerful black leader of the Efik people in 1760. So a lot of people don't understand that much of the slave trade was conducted in Africa by other Africans and then sold to white people. Grandy King George owned hundreds of slaves whom he employed to capture still more slaves in the African interior. Africans were captured from cultures such as the Wolof, the Yoruba, the Hausa, Igbo, Bantu, Akan, Angolan, Asante, Bambara, Gambian, Igbo, Mandinga, among others. They grew rice, tobacco, sugar, and later cotton for their slave masters. In fact, it was the African slaves who introduced rice to the colonies, which was originally grown in Carolina. And so, you'll sometimes see there's an ad for Carolina rice. What, Carolina? That was grown in another part. No, it's grown in Carolina initially here in the colonies. And now it's grown more widely, like in California and Texas as well. Plantation owners preferred to have slaves from the same African cultures because there would be less tribal friction. So just like Native Americans have strong tribal identities, so did Africans. So different cultures were sent to specific parts of the New World so that you would have compatible tribes among your slaves. Slave owners prized and encouraged slave babies because it was a free slave for life. And so have all the babies you want because I don't even have to pay to have a slave brought over. I got my own slave baby who will be a slave for all that kid's adult life. By the 1740s, the majority of Southern slaves were born in the country. Colonial laws did not limit the force masters could use against slaves, and slaves often resisted their masters' demands because, as one traveler noted, quote, the greatness of soul, unquote, that the slaves demonstrated. As much as possible, the slaves maintained their African kinship ties and the importance of family. That was not lost in the slave owners because family ties would be a bond that could possibly threaten the slave owner. And so as a result, once the kids were old enough, the slave owner would sell off the members of the family. If you've ever had the opportunity, if not, please do watch the old series Roots, where you see the horrible tragedy parents experience watching their kids get sold off to other slave owners in other parts of the colonies. In fact, I don't know this is a fact, but I have read that one of the reasons why African Americans often refer to each other as brother and sister is because after the war was over during the Reconstruction era, uh, siblings were trying to find each other. So they would be on street corners calling out, "Are you my brother? Are you my sister?" While most slaves were concentrated in the southern colonies, all of the northern colonies also had slaves, but in dramatically lower numbers. In fact, with the founding of the United States by 1804, all of the northern colonies emancipated their slaves, New Jersey being the last one in 1804. So, getting back to the justification of the economic exploitation, why did English colonists consider themselves superior to Africans? Because you would have to believe that, or you couldn't enslave another group of people. Well, first, black was not a neutral color to the colonists. Black meant to English colonists, now this is from the Oxford English Dictionary, in other words, British Dictionary. Black meant to English colonists, quote, deeply stained with dirt, soiled, dirty, foul, having dark or deadly purposes, malignant, pertaining to or involving death, deadly, baneful, disastrous, sinister, foul, iniquitous, atrocious, horrible, and wicked. And those were the positive terms. So black being the opposite of white, which connoted purity, beauty, and goodness, attributes the colonists identified with themselves. By the middle of the 17th century, other than indentured servants, remember indentured servants, they were people from Europe, white people from Europe who were poor, but they wanted to come over to the New World and get a new start or escape religious persecution in Europe. And so how would they afford the passage? Well, somebody would pay for their passage, and then that contract was sold to somebody in the United States who would then have this person as an indentured servant for maybe as long as 7 years until that person effectively paid off the passage fee for the ship fee to come over to America. So there were lots of indentured servants also in the colonies. So by the middle of the 17th century, the colonists referred to themselves as not only English, but as free, suggesting their belief that the people who were not English were not free. So by 1680, colonists referred to themselves as white, acknowledging the color of free people. By the end of the 17th century, 1600s. By the end of the 17th century, blacks were triply cursed in English eyes. They were un-English, unwhite, and unfree. This served to harden English notions about social hierarchy, about their superiority and the inferiority of slaves. This justified, the English believed, their exploitation of Africans' labor. These justifications plant the seeds of racial prejudices that have flourished ever since in America. You know, that's staying power in terms of the same stereotypes exist even today. There's a video I show in my minorities course, and it goes back to the 1800s called Ethnic Notions, and it shows some of the stereotypes we have today are rooted in the 1830s. Stereotypes about blacks. Excuse me. Okay, what's the second justification for exploiting African Americans and enslaving them? Africans, I should say, and enslaving them. Well, the argument is that English technological progress was superior versus that of African tribal cultures. Okay, so here's the argument. Look at how you people live in Africa. You're living as in these tribal cultures, how primitive. We're going to bring you over to America, you know, and look at our progress. Look at our technological stuff, you know, that makes, you know, you people living in your primitive tribal villages like, come on, we're going to give you an opportunity to step up to a better life of technological progress. Okay, let's examine that argument. What it's saying is the sole basis to measure a society would be on its technological progress. All right, so go back to the 1930s, and who was the superior technological society on the planet? It was Nazi Germany. They were far more advanced than the United States. They were ahead of us in missile development. They were ahead of us in developing the atomic bomb, which is why Einstein realized this and said to the president of the United States, you better start working on a bomb right now, or they're going to have one before us. And that was one of the big races for the Allies in invading Europe, is to try to get to Germany before they developed an atomic bomb and used it. Okay, so yes, they were the most technologically advanced society in the 1930s, but they're also the poster child for moral depravity as a society. So Hitler's Germany. So yes, technological progress, but the morality of a worm. So you can't just measure a society by its technological progress. So look at the Southern plantation owners. Yeah, technological progress, but the fact that you would enslave people shows you too had the morality of a worm. The third justification was the superiority of Christianity as part of English superiority. In other words, look at what your tribal people practice. It's called animism. Animism we'll investigate a little bit more when we get to religion, but it literally is from the root word anima, not enema, anima. Enema, that's a real pain in the ass. No, it's anima. Anima is like the root word for animation, make something lifelike. Okay, so animism effectively says there is consciousness, God is everywhere. But Christianity says, no, there is only one God. And so that is a superior way of looking at God. And so we're going to convert you to Christianity, because doesn't it say in the Bible, only he that is baptized and believeth is saved? So we're going to do you a favor by converting you to Christianity, and that way you'll be saved too. So these were the three justifications for economically exploiting Africans and enslaving them. Please hold your applause to the end. In fact, that is the end. Instead, just put a few bills in the donation jar, which will be available for you at the end of this presentation. All righty. Okay, the last thing you need to know for the exam is on page 403. You got to look carefully. It's in there. It's on that page, but you got to look for it a little bit. It's a Swedish sociologist named Gunnar Myrdal, M-Y-R-D-A-L. And on that page, he describes the American dilemma. It is a democratic society's basic denial of basic rights and freedoms to one category of people. People would speak of equality, but do little to make all categories of people equal. Many white people resolve this dilemma by defining Black people as inferior and undeserving of equality. Now, you will notice that he wrote this in the 1940s. And you're probably thinking, yeah, okay, Maynard, but that was quite some time ago, 80 years ago. Why would we need to know this now? Okay, here's why. This is a 2016 Pew Research Center report. In it, it found that 40% of Black Americans doubt the country will ever reach the point where they are treated as equal to whites, while 40% of white Americans believe it's already happened. Now, this is nothing new. If you go back to opinion polls conducted even after the Civil War and ask people, is there a race problem in America? Overwhelmingly, Blacks would say, hell yeah. And whites would go, no, we got that all under control now. There is no race problem. And continue to say that, showing the difference between Blacks and whites' perspective on their lives. 40% of whites think that there is too much focus on race, while 60% of Blacks say that there is too little focus on race. 46% of whites describe race relations as generally good, but 61% of Blacks said they're generally bad. Only 20% of whites believe that racism was institutional or systemic, while 40% of Blacks thought so. 70% of whites said that individual people discriminating against Blacks was the biggest issue in racism, not systemic racism, just individual acts. Latino views were most closely aligned with those of Blacks. And so that leads us to the term white privilege. It's a term for societal privileges that benefit people identified as white in Western countries beyond what is commonly experienced by non-white people under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. Okay, so the best way I can explain it is I'll give most white people the benefit of the doubt. To me, there's a difference between ignorance and stupidity. Ignorance means, hey, you don't know any better. Stupidity means you know better and you're doing it anyway. Okay, so let's give most white people the benefit of the doubt. Hey, we're ignorant of our own prejudices. We don't know what it's like to have black skin or dark skin in America and what that entails on a day-to-day basis. There's a woman named Peggy McIntosh who wrote an article that's required reading, and she lists some 50 different things that when you have white skin, you don't have to even think twice about when you walk out the door each day. But if you have dark skin, any one of these 50 things could happen to you, or multiples of those 50 things could happen to you each day. I can tell you countless stories from black students telling me how they get followed around when they're in stores by the clerks. And this isn't just, oh, they're super sensitive. No, 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 no. I've seen studies monitor the same thing where they watch on video cameras that's exactly the case. White people aren't followed around. Black people are by the clerks. Or one of my favorite examples is this I heard in 3 different courses by 3 different women. These were black women who, and the one had a French sounding last name. Okay. So they all responded to an ad, each separately 3 different times. They each had responded to an ad for employment. And so they called up, and in each case, the story kind of went like this. The HR person said, oh my gosh, thank goodness you called. You sound like you have all the credentials we've been looking for. We've been running this ad for a while. Nobody, has your credentials. Could you come down today for a personal interview? Absolutely. Let me get cleaned up. I'm on my way. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. As soon as the woman walks in the door, the HR person gives her the elevator look, like as in, holy shit, you're black. And all of a sudden says the following: this is so awkward, but in the last hour, we just filled the position. I'm so sorry you had to come down here needlessly. 3 different students told me the same story that had happened to them or someone they knew. So this is the kind of prejudice and discrimination that's unfortunately is systematic and endemic in America. So again, whites are not aware of what it's like to have dark skin. And that's why when whites are asked, is there a race problem? Go, no, because you don't experience it, right? Whereas blacks are experiencing it every single day. And what are they experiencing? Prejudice and discrimination at the hands of whites. So again, yeah, we got prejudices. Do black people have prejudices too? Sure, they were raised with prejudices as well. Then you could say, well, there's such a thing as black racism. No, there is not black racism. There are blacks perhaps who are racist, but there is not black racism because blacks do not control the political and economic structure of society. Whites do. So there can only be white systemic racism. There can't be black systemic racism. They don't control the show. So, yes, we have prejudices. Can we do anything about it? Sure, you can. First of all, you got to identify that you have them. An exercise I have the students do in the diversity classes, just go look at where you got these prejudices. Look at the origins of them. Think about it. Where did you learn the stuff you learned about race or gender or ethnicity? Religion? Where'd you learn this stuff? Because part of it is identifying that, you know what? I think about it now. Yeah, my dad was such a bigot. I used to hear this stuff all the time. That was my example. And my mother. And so I heard it all the time. It's amazing I've gotten to the point where I have, in terms of how many prejudices I've had to ferret out, and hope I've gotten them all. And, the second thing is you can't get down on yourself when you suddenly realize you have a prejudice. It's like, okay, yeah, here's the best example I can give you. And I'm going to take a real leap of faith here. Do you know how when you come to college, you learn all kinds of things that they go, that's what they taught you in high school, but that's BS. Here's the real truth. You go, man, why didn't they tell us in high school? I guess you weren't ready for the truth then yet, but now you are. So I'm going to tell you, there ain't no Santa Claus. Whoa, man, you're too far, too far. There is no Easter Bunny either, right? Hey, you got rid of that. I'll give you pro wrestling's real. I'll give you that one. How's that? Let's make you feel better. Okay, so you eventually learned there's no Santa Claus. And then for a while, you might even been pissed off at your parents. Why did you lie to me? But probably not. And then you went along with it too with your younger siblings, and play along with your kids. Hey, there's a Santa Claus, right? You got rid of that. Why can't you get rid of the prejudices too? You know? Now, when you find you got a prejudice, don't get down on yourself. Did you get down on yourself for believing there was a Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny? No, you just got rid of it. And sometimes you'll be surprised. I continue to be surprised by every now and then something will push a hot button to me. I go, wait a minute, my reaction there was uh, racist or sexist or whatever. I go, okay, there's another one, Maynard. Time to work on that one. You didn't even know it was there. Time to get rid of it. And if you can't get rid of it, now you have to ask yourself, what purpose does holding on to that stereotype or prejudice serve you? Okay, in terms of airbrushing civil rights history, Americans across the political spectrum look back on the civil rights movement with historical reverence. School children of all races memorize Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century, along with Kennedy's inaugural speech, I might add. Conservatives invoke the movement as a model for our own activism, while civil rights activists are viewed as national heroes. But in their day, King and his fellow activists were viewed by most white Americans as dangerous troublemakers. When Southern mobs attacked freedom riders who were protesting bus segregation in 1961, a Gallup poll, which was a common public opinion poll at that time, a Gallup poll showed 61% of Americans disapproved of the protesters. In a 1966 Harris survey, 85% of whites said mass demonstrations and sit-ins would hurt the advancement of civil rights. Why? Most whites reflexively side with authority and the status quo over minorities who demand equal treatment. For that same reason, fewer than 1/3 of white Americans approve of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has protested police shootings and mistreatment of Black civilians. Many whites flatly deny that police discriminate against Blacks and portray the protesters as dangerous thugs. When Americans look back at the Black Lives Matter movement a century from now, will they paint a rosier picture, as in revisionist history? Folks, this was written in 2017. It's even more true today in terms of how people view Black Lives Matters. Here's a quote from an anonymous source, meaning I don't know who it was, said, "This is the only necessary form of humility, the realization that difference is normal." Let me give you another example of how we don't get it as whites. The question was, on the average, Blacks have worse jobs, income, and housing than white people. Do you think these differences are mainly due to discrimination? Yes, 37%. No, 61%. Is it because most Blacks have less inborn ability to learn? Yes, 10%. No, 87%. Is it because most Blacks don't have the chance for formal education? Yes, 46%. No, 51%. Is it because most Blacks don't have the motivation or willpower, as in Blacks are lazy? Yes, 46%. No, 49%. So half the public, mostly whites, still believe that Blacks are lazy somehow, that it's their own fault they haven't been able to advance in society. Okay, so hey, these are difficult times. When Trump became president, the former leader of the Ku Klux Klan Um, and his name will come to me in a moment. But anyway, the former leader of the Ku Klux Klan, who is still a key member of white supremacist movements and ideology, uh, cried. He openly cried because he said, finally, we have a president who understands us. And so, under this presidential administration, and I'm not going to go so far as to say Trump is racist because he has already pointed out he's the least racist person you'll ever meet. So, I'm not going to make that claim. But what I will say is racists think he's racist because he won't denounce them either. Even in the presidential debate, he refused to denounce white supremacists. So, and this is a shame because there's been an unfortunate association between people who are conservatives with also being racist, which is totally not true. But I will say there are conservatives who are certainly racist. There are probably liberals who are racist, true. But I'm simply saying that association has become even stronger because of Trump. Okay, so the bottom line is, folks, we can do this. Now, I always chuckle because, and perhaps this will happen with our class discussions coming up on this, our next threaded discussion, is that I often hear students argue that, you know what, you know, there is still prejudice and discrimination, but we're not as prejudiced as the generation before us, that it keeps getting better. And you know what? That's absolutely true in my observation as well. Since the 1960s, I have seen each generation, you know, become increasingly less prejudiced. We're not there yet, but increasingly less prejudiced. Now, having said that, you know, and I've heard students say, you know, when these old people die off, then we'll get rid of prejudice. It's these old people. That's exactly what we said in the 1960s as well. So apparently enough old people haven't died off yet for us to have prejudice discrimination as a thing in the past. But for those of you who say it'll never change, I differ. I disagree because it is learned, we can all unlearn. And because it is learned, we can stop teaching prejudice. And then we can try to reach some level of racial harmony here in America. That's all for now, kids. See you with chapter 16 sometime soon. Bye.